kind of guy, pattern recognition guy. And I caught the HCI bug just before I left. Somebody taught me a few things about how to wire circuits together and microcontrollers. And so I had a kind of a software person's view of hardware. So I know nothing about power electronics or analog electronics, really. I always have to find someone else to help me with that. But as long as I can stay in digital realm, I'm pretty good with hardware, like most people, I suppose. And so then after that, it was just just doing HCI at Microsoft Research, and I've been there for almost 20 years. I think my 20th anniversary is coming up in a few weeks, actually. And I've been doing a lot of work, I guess, more recently in VR and AR. I worked on the devices that eventually led to the Kinect product. And then before that, I worked on the Surface table, the big table, the 30-inch, or the big coffee table device. And so I always feel like AR, for me, I always look at it, VR and AR, as through the lens of more of a ubiquitous computing perspective, in the sense that, like if you think about the Surface table, I always thought about that as like, it's really all about interacting with physical objects, right? Putting a physical object on a table and then having the graphics surround that physical object. I was never interested in applications on the table that did not involve physical objects. And so when I think about the depth camera work, moving from the Surface table to the depth camera, to me that was just it's all the same thing, just lifting it into another dimension, right? And so going from 2D or 2.5D to 3D. And so I've been just sort of following my nose really through that entire space. And so that sort of brought me to VR and AR. So that's my 20-year history of research sort of compressed into a few tens of seconds, I guess. So does that make sense?
Completely. You a bit already answered my next question. So I think as researcher, we think of the perfect place to work, and Microsoft, there, at least the rumors say that you are free to do whatever you want, probably in a certain kind of range. So you're already a bit told why you ended up doing AR, VR, but can you a bit more maybe explain what the excitement is about, beyond why you kind of automatically came there starting from the tabletop?
Why I came to, my son brought my cat, very good. So why I came to, you heard us talking about cats. So why I came to MSR?
To AR, VR, right?
Oh, to AR and VR, yeah. So it was really just, let's see. So I was thinking about AR, really, we touched on the IllumiRoom project, using projectors as a way to do, some people call it spatial AR. And I'm fine with that label. And just sort of falling into using projectors to do AR. And I think there's still a lot of good reasons to think about projection, spatial AR, from the perspective of it's compared to, having a headset, it's kind of liberating, right? To sort of push the projection into your environment. It's a very sort of ubiquitous computing kind of perspective that you have this, the interaction sort of surrounds you, and sort of has this, this very quiet sort of feel to it. When you're not using it, it kind of recedes into the background. And so for me, there was a sort of almost a magical quality. There was one project in particular that most people don't really know too much about. It wasn't something that was, it was published, but it didn't make a big splash. And that was this really simple demo of projecting down onto a tabletop. This is when I was doing the tabletop work. And you drive this, you put down physical objects on the tabletop, and then you drive with an Xbox controller, you drive this little car around on the tabletop, right? And you can move pieces of whatever, like you make a little ramp out of cardboard, and then the car drives up the ramp and it behaves appropriately, and you can build these little courses with the car, right? And there's a physics engine behind it, which is very important, right? To do this kind of simulation of the geometry of the table, and then the physics and the motion of the car. And you drive the car around on the table. And that was just like, when I put that together, it was just like, wow, there's something really neat going on here. Just sort of, and it was just a really nice blending of the real and the virtual, right? And this was also kind of in that time frame when we were doing some things with the tabletop, where we're using rear projection, where you would put down these little tanks, these little model tanks. I think we found these in a toy store, and then somebody hacked the infrared transmitters and for these little remote control tanks, and you could drive these little tanks around, and then the computer would actually drive one around as well on the tabletop. And then you could interact with the geometry. You can make holes, and then it was just like this really interesting interplay, I think, between the real and the physical. And so just kind of like that, to me, that's like an interesting viewpoint on augmented reality, that it's not about headsets necessarily. I think headsets are very interesting, but I would offer up the spatial augmented reality as it's kind of a nice kind of alternative to what people are doing in headsets. And I often get this question within the company of, why are you doing this? Why aren't you full-time on HoloLens? And I do HoloLens stuff, but I really like the spatial augmented reality, because it just feels better when you get it working, right? There's just something about it that I think has that the magical quality that I have mentioned a couple times. And I think that if the company is successful, or if in general, if we are as a field successful in augmented reality, there will be room for these other kinds of modalities, right? We don't have to be dogmatic about form factors. We don't have to say, it's all about headsets. It's going to be about what you can do with your phone. It's going to be what you can do with headsets. It's what you can do with higher infrastructure environments, like a really tricked out conference room at school, right, with projectors and whatnot, right? There's a whole gamut of things. And so I'm not usually one to sort of get hung up by these discussions around, is it about a headset or is it about projectors? I think it's all of the above, right? And just for me, it just so happens that that it's kind of, for me, I came into this AR in a sort of a very funny path, so that's kind of my perspective on AR. It's a little unusual, I suppose. But.
So I think I just pick it up here with the notion of magic. I think we have seen sort of, if you go back to founding of Disney, I think the idea that computer graphics is creating magic in our head by our perception. I think what you're talking about, if we now think of AR and VR, it's basically pushing magic to a completely new dimension. And I think the Illumio room, which we had at the beginning, it's really, I think, the question, what is real and what is not real? So how do we get the notion of reality right? Because I think 30 years back, reality was very clear. It's the non-digital stuff. But now, as reality is basically so digital, where do you draw the line? Or does it make sense to even think along the lines of that this is reality and this is augmented reality? Or is it a misnomer by now?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about, not in this whole COVID-19 thing where we're stuck at home. At least here, I'm stuck at home, interacting with everyone through these displays. I have to question reality a little bit some days. Some days it's harder than others to sort of figure out what is real. And, maybe I think what you're touching on is that it's kind of a conventional. It's a convention, right? When we say something is real, what we mean is it's real for a given time frame, right? For a given age of technology, right? If I were to show what we're doing right now, the fact that I'm having a conversation, you know, across the entire globe, if I showed that to someone from the 18th century, it would blow their minds, right? I don't think they would really understand what was going on. It would take a long time to explain what's going on. So, but this is our reality, right?
And so I think just digging a bit deeper there, I think the experience, and that brings us to this basic usability question. The experience we have, it's, if you take current technology, it very often breaks. So this experience, if you have a VR headset, if you have an AR headset, sort of, you're in this other world and a pop-up comes up and you're really back to sort of where you understand, oh, this was just not reality. And so for me, this leads to one of the questions Katrin and I discussed, is really, what is the fundamental challenge now? If we talk about what will move AR, VR from this lapsing, all of us get really excited about, to something the real world gets excited about. And I think I did recently in one of the lectures, we had students research the relationship in sales between VR and AR headsets and mobile phones. And it's 1 to 100. For each sold VR, AR headset, 100 phones are sold. So roughly, so basically it's a very niche thing. So we are really excited, but it's very niche. What does it take from sort of the research questions, not a business case, it's really the research. What do we have to do to make this reality?
Yeah, it's like I get the feeling that like VR headsets are today what car phones were back in the 80s, right? Yeah, only a certain segment of the population is willing to put up with a car phone. I recently stumbled across an old car phone. It was my dad's actually. And yeah, it's quite extraordinary to sort of pick this thing up and the heft of it. I mean, it's just remarkable. Anyway, so what is it going to take to make this kind of stuff mainstream? I think it's going to, from the research community, I think it's just going to take faith, right? That you know, that with time, you know, we'll all sort of contribute a little bit here and there and make it more usable, more compelling. That we'll do things that make it, you know, tip the balance and kind of that cost benefit analysis that people seem to make all the time. And, you know, Bill Buxton always likes to talk about he calls it the long tail of innovation, right? He likes to tell the story of that it took 20 years for the mouse to become mainstream, you know, to go from Engelbart's wooden block to, you know, the mid 80s when it you know, became more or less ubiquitous in software. And as a researcher, you know, if you were involved with you know, these kinds of devices, you'd say, oh man, why is it taking so damn long to sort of transfer my idea? Clearly it's a wonderful idea. Why can't the rest of the world sort of understand my point of view? And it's just, you know, he talks very eloquently, certainly much more eloquently than I do, about the fact that, you know, it's just one of these things where like the whole ecosystem around the device kind of has to be ready for it, right? And right now I kind of feel like VR is sort of like, it's such a strange thing, right? It sort of goes off in a particular direction. It goes too far, right? For most people, it just goes it's too crazy. And eventually what will happen is it'll become normalized, right? It will become less crazy, right? And eventually will become a normal part of, you know, entertainment, for example. You could say that it'll become a normal part of playing games, right? I think that's a much more plausible thing to say than it'll become a normal part of, I don't know, communications just yet, right? And so you're starting to see some of that, right? You see that the PSVR, for example, is, you know, sold however many units or whatever, and it's become normalized, become a normal piece of furniture in one's living room, in some places, not mine, but so anyway, I think it'll just take some time. And I think that as researchers, you know, we kind of have to just like keep a long-term view of what's going on, right? I don't think there's any magic bullet.
Like, could you also think of more integrating physicality or haptics into AR? Like, So far, it's mainly vision that we rely on, like less audio, which probably also is easy to implement. But Albrecht and me and also others try to integrate haptics, and we surely do not want to 3D print, objects in real time. But I don't know, do you have visions there? Do you go into that direction? Because controllers may not be the right thing. It's probably feasible in VR, but what about AR and haptics?
Yeah, so I think that there's, yeah, I had the occasion to actually try out one of the very earliest Vive devices. This was back in Valve's lab. This is way before the thing came out as a product. Valve had a few of us in the area over just to try out their device, because they weren't being very secretive at all. They just wanted people to get people excited about VR, and as far as Valve is concerned, I suppose they're fine as long as they can sell games through Steam. Anyway, so they had us over and they showed us their device, and it was a very clunky sort of device, and you'd be very critical of it. But they put you in a room, in a small room, and they had done the work of calibrating the space, the physical space to the virtual space. And then they replicated some of the objects in the space, right? And so there was a light switch in the virtual experience. And so the person running the demo said, yeah, go out and reach out and turn the light switch on. And so you reach for the light switch. And of course, they had just a really nice example of passive haptics, where as you reach for the virtual light switch, that was the real light switch for the room. Right, so you touched that and you flipped it, and then the lights came on in the virtual scene, except it wasn't quite the same, right? There was something else that was revealed at that point. But that moment, in that moment, like there was certainly a surprise, like a very pleasant surprise that I had of like, wow, that really just feels great, right? Of course it feels great because it's exactly the thing you're trying to simulate, right? As a haptic simulation, it's perfect. So yeah, the notion that haptics plays a role, absolutely, right? And I think that's an interesting way in which AR and VR, of course, blend. They have a lot more to do with one another than some people realize, of course, where, we've done some examples in the lab where we've rendered, parts of the real world into the virtual world, right? You use depth cameras or whatever. I see David Lindelbauer is on the call. So he did some of that work with us a few summers ago, where you bring in real world geometry into the VR headset and then render that. And then, for many purposes, one of which is so that you don't walk into it, or you reach out and you can touch it. And of course that invites other kinds of fun things where you can, instead of rendering the environment faithfully, you can go in and make it special, right? You can tweak it. You make it look like it's from Middle Earth or something. I don't know. It's totally up to the designer. And so there's just this huge, I think the thing that's really fun now is just contemplating all the different crazy things one can do to combine the real world and the virtual. And that's the really exciting part right now, is just having that ability.
So that brings two questions to my mind. One is basically the controller question, and we recently had a PhD, and I think I've seen also Pascal Knierin was earlier on the call. He basically looked into controllers for VR, or how to interact with VR, and I think what's out in the marketplace is fairly boring, because I think people try to save money, and I think, and in the lab we have seen so many exciting things. So I think that's one direction. But I think I wonder if the haptics really matter that much, if we get more of the experience right in basically creating things where the haptics play less of a role, because we know haptics are expensive, like that the things you were talking is sort of, I guess if we need sort of robots that provide light switches and stuff like this, and I think also Matthias Hoppe is in the call, having drones flying you the light switch where it needs to be, that's really a lot of effort. And so the question is, and I think taking the Kinect as one example, I usually use this as an example. I felt the early Kinect had really bad tracking, but it didn't matter because the games were so great,
Mm-hmm.
built on, so basically the people who built the games knew the limitations of the Kinect. And so you as the user, if you basically played the game, you never experienced the limitation. If you as a researcher tried to use it, then you were really surprised how well or how bad the tracking was. I think that improved over time. But I think this question of content and interaction, what are your thoughts on this? If we talk now at VR, basically, what are the first things, and you said games, what are the first things that are going to work without having much more than we have now?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, if I knew the answer to that question, I'm not sure I'd be sitting around here. It's a really good question. You know, I think the haptics question, I mean, not quite answering your question, you know, I think one thing that I'm thinking about is the fact that, you know, in the research literature, there's a lot of excitement around haptic controllers of one sort or another. And if I look at that sort of dispassionately, right, I feel like each of these controllers, they're really interesting in their own right, but they're sort of nibbling off like one little scenario, right? One at a time. And each one of them is kind of expensive and sort of exotic. And one can hardly imagine like really productizing most of them. But, you know, and so I think people are sort of like trying to figure out like, what is the one haptic device to rule them all, right? And we don't really know what that's going to be. You know, what is that one thing that actually like makes sense for a broad variety of let's say games. I don't, and I think that's one of those problems where it's like, oh man, it's really hard until somebody actually comes up with it and figures it out, right? So we're just right now we're just kind of like taking shots at this problem. Maybe somebody will figure it out. But it's true, you know, that you know, just given what you have now and the experience and the content, you know, I think in the gaming quarter, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because there are certain kinds of content. There's certain like things that people really figure out that really make sense for a particular modality, right? A particular gaming setup. And I don't think we're quite there. Like people are still sort of, you know, doing the same things that made sense before VR and hoping that it sticks in VR, right? Where, you know, I think the really interesting things are probably still being worked on. Unfortunately, still haven't come to light. You know, something that some kid in a garage is actually putting together right now, hopefully in COVID-19, that'll, you know, will come to light and sort of nail the experience of VR. Yeah,
I think one of the really successful things we also talked last week was Pokemon Go, which again, from a researcher's perspective, that felt like, oh, that was the start of my PhD 2000. And I think sort of it's this 20-year period you talked earlier about. So perhaps with this question, then back to Katrin, what is your take on Pokemon Go? Did you play it? Is it AR or is it just, yeah, not really?
No, it's totally AR. I think it's wonderful. I mean, I haven't played it, to be honest with you, but you know, I was at some point during the summer when it was super hot. Like I thought it was very funny I could look out the window of my office at work and I would see these people gathering in clumps, sort of just outside, you know, just down on the outside on the lawn. And I knew exactly what was going on there because they were all looking at their phone, looking around like this kind, you know, doing this kind of thing. So I think it's totally AR, right? It's just a particular magical combination. I think you know, Pokemon Go, the thing I worry about with some of those things, like think about like how many of us actually, you know, who are into computer games have a Guitar Hero guitar in their closet, right? You know, it's like these things, they really go and just in fads, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. Maybe I don't have a judgment on that, but you know, and the you know, same goes for the Nintendo Wii, right? It sort of made its big splash, and you know, to be honest with you, Pokemon Go, Guitar Hero, Nintendo Wii, they're not any less fun today than they were when they were launched, and yet somehow we're not playing them, and I think that's why aren't we? Why is that still not part of what we're doing? I don't know. It's like it's kind of weird. Kinect is most people's Kinects are still in their closet. I still bump into people that play Kinect all the time, but it's still, and so it's like somehow there's something else that we're missing there when we're talking about this kind of stuff, where it's like it's part of the community of users, that somehow those devices, these modes, they sort of fall out of use and they never sort of come back for some reason. I don't know why. They just they become part of the background, and and the stage is set for the next thing, right? And people are trying to figure out what the next thing is. I don't know.
Yeah, we wanted to ask you about a possible killer app, but you sent us a video about using like depth camera also to combat the spread of coronavirus. And in the end of the video, you say that the cost of network probably, is doesn't matter because of the potential loss of life, that we do not do. But I don't know how aware you are like of Germany. I think we are kind of most sensitive about cameras in the environment. And we definitely do not have the time to, set cameras like in the next months, like all over the place. So in post-corona time, do you think acceptability of cameras in the environment will kind of change? And how can we as researchers also show the benefit of tracking like in the public or in semi-public spaces for augmented reality, of course?
Yeah, well, let me just say that for that work, the trade-off of having a bunch of cameras monitoring a space, the trade-off is I think is clear, right? If you are in a if we're talking about let's say a long-term care facility, right? Where the virus really spreads like wildfire, it seems. Some of the initial, maybe the start of the pandemic really sort of took hold, at least here in Seattle, it really sort of got its hold in one of these nursing homes. I think that the concerns around privacy may take a back seat towards the concern around safety and health. I think that's sort of one attitude. So for those of you who didn't catch it, it's basically a series. You mount a series of depth cameras, and then what it does is it quickly builds a static model of everything that's in the room. And then as you kind of wander through the room and then you touch various surfaces, the system keeps a histogram, a 3D histogram of where you've touched in the world. Sort of, it's kind of a lightweight. It's just surface, man. It's the same thing, right? The tabletop, we're sensing touch. But and the idea is that you can also detect when two people approach and then shake hands. Maybe it'll play an obnoxious sound, right? Just to keep people from shaking hands. And this was conceived of really back during the day when we all thought it was much more about touching your face, or that the virus was transmitted through fomites. Those door handles and elevator buttons and these kinds of things. And now it's much more about, wearing face masks and, not coughing on each other. And we think that the virus has spread through aerosols, but I think the touching still has a role. Anyway, but back to the original spirit of the question, it was, I think, for certain kinds of environments, I think this trade-off may actually make sense, right? And in how policy changes around, those kinds of things, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can really speak to that. One thing that I think is an interesting challenge still is just the idea that you could have a kind of sensor that somehow it discloses more readily like what it's capable of, right? The idea that I can make an argument that when you switch on a depth camera, it's not the same thing as a video camera, right? That the representations that you're taking from this device are fundamentally different than color video camera, right? We can argue about whether or not you can still recognize people through a range image or a depth image or the skeletal tracking data from one of these cameras. And I think that's a very interesting problem of how do you do little bits of local computation so that you avoid this question of privacy. It's certainly a relevant thing when you're talking about many cameras. You kind of almost need to do that technically, because you don't want to bring all that imagery to a central computer or a central server. And or maybe you bring it into the cloud and do some computation, then the problem is interesting. But how do you do all of that in a way that people actually believe you, right? The people that are actually in that environment, how they look at that thing and they say, oh, it's fine, it's just one of these, whatever, they might look at it and no different than a thermostat hanging on the wall, right? They don't even see it. But for now, I think it's this trade-off of, for certain kinds of environments, I think it makes a lot of, I think that trade-off is, might have been worth it. I'm not sure that it is still. That's a sort of another discussion.
And I think this trade-off hasn't been discussed very well. I think we see countries that have moved mainly with apps, but I think the idea of using technology, if you look to South Korea, using technology to combat it, and then the contrast is Europe, where basically we put data privacy over physical freedom. So it's really interesting to see that there is very little belief that technology can help. If we see the discussion at the moment in Europe, that basically restricting the physical movement seems much easier for a politician to do, as we see now with the lockdowns in Austria and in Germany, than restricting people's freedom in the digital space, which I think 10 years back, we probably would have not believed that this is the case. And I think this may also have to do that a lot of us are not involved in discussions. And I think that may be something also having the audience get involved in discussing those things, because we know a lot. And as Andy said, we can build things. I think we have probably a lot of understanding how things work. And so we should not stand out of the political discussion. And I think we have one final question, and then we switch the recording off and also switch to the audience. And I think this is something to do, I think, over the last 10 years, social media has changed what people believe, what they don't believe. It's basically the effect of the bubble, we sometimes say. So people surround themselves with an environment they believe in. And this is sort of just even on a textual basis, or by now on videos on phones. Now imagine we have AR, VR technologies and the same effect of social media. Is this sort of going to break our society? Because I can live in my own world, which is completely different from somebody else's world. And I don't even have to engage with a world that's different than mine.
Well, yeah, and I think what you're worried about, I guess, is the idea that I'll put my helmet on and I'll sort of tune out, right? And that's the end of it. And that'll be very isolating. I don't know that that's any different fundamentally than where we are today with computing in general, right? The immersion is certainly turned up to 11, right, with VR. And so that's kind of the interesting thing is like the way kids are sort of getting involved in VR. Like I've been having fun trying out various things with my kids, but I don't see them like becoming obsessed with it or, being carried away with it. They still like to go outside and do stuff. And
so I was not just thinking about this one. I was really thinking about if we have AR, let's assume I see the world different. Basically, we walk down the same street.
Oh,
And basically, I get a street built that it fits my world model of, oh, I love to be here. And somebody else may have, oh, this looks really gross. And we both get sort of the right images to, because that's what we see with social media. We get fed what we like in order to stay in the space. And I think taking on sort of augmented reality, we can be physically, nowadays, if we're physically in the same space, we roughly see the same things. But I think this may fundamentally change.
Right. I mean, you could shorten this whole discussion to just refer to the Dark Mirror episode, which one of the Dark Mirror episodes we're talking about here. I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question. It's like, it's a real concern. I'm not sure I have anything smart to say about that, to be honest with you. if I could buy the, some crazy, module for my AR headset that just, erases homeless people, right? And what impact does that have, right? I think it's a really interesting concern. Wow, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it was more also like something so I think it's not probably the thing we can find an answer. And I think by this, we would, looking at a time, we switched the recording off now. We have another 20 minutes to keep a casual discussion. If you have a question, just put a